The mat was silent, not the silence of an empty room, but the thick, charged silence of 60 people holding their breath at once. A man in a spotless white jai bowed toward a janitor in grey coveralls, and the janitor bowed back without a trace of fear. The billionaire's smile was thin, practiced, the kind that had humiliated a dozen challengers before. Breakfast and never once cost him a night's sleep. He had built his empire the same way he fought, by finding the weakest point in a man and pressing until something broke. Tonight, he believed he had found the easiest target of his career, a maintenance worker who mopped these very floors after midnight, invited onto the mat as a joke for his corporate guests, and the cameras quietly recording behind them. The billionaire cracked his neck, rolled his shoulders, and gestured lazily for the janitor to take his stance, the way a man might wave off a waiter. Somewhere near the back wall, a phone was already filming, angled to catch the humiliation from the most flattering side. The janitor did not move like a man who was afraid. He moved like a man who was remembering something buried a long time ago, something he had promised himself he would never need again. His feet settled into the mat with a stillness that made the more experienced instructors near the front row lean forward, though none of them could have said exactly why. Somewhere in the crowd, a small girl in a second-hand dress gripped her backpack strap so tightly her knuckles went pale and whispered a single word under her breath. "Dad." What happened over the next few hours would change both of their lives forever. Before we begin, if you believe kindness, humility, and second chances can change the world, please take a moment to like this video, comment where you're watching from, share this story with someone who needs inspiration today, and subscribe to the Aura Fables for more unforgettable stories. 3 months earlier, in Seattle, Marcus Hale owned the top floor of a glass tower that looked down on the entire waterfront, where the sound turned silver in the evening light, and the ferries moved like slow, patient clocks. He was a billionaire twice over, an 8th Dan black belt in Aikido, and a man who had never once lost a match he genuinely cared about winning. Marcus collected trophies the way other men collected regrets, quietly, obsessively, and without ever admitting the true cost of the collection. He sponsored an annual invitational at his private dojo, where junior executives, minor celebrities, and the occasional desperate city official lined up to be thrown across the mat, all so Marcus could feel for one evening that he was still the strongest man in any room he chose to enter. He judged people in the space of a single glance, a cheap watch, worn-out shoes, a slight stoop in the shoulders that spoke of long hours and little rest. To Marcus, these were signs of a smaller life, and smaller lives in his private accounting did not deserve his patience or his respect. His assistants had learned to read his silences. His board members had learned never to disagree with him twice. He had built walls so tall around his certainty that he no longer noticed how much they had cost him. A marriage that had quietly ended 2 years earlier, and a son who called on birthdays out of obligation rather than affection. David Coyne mopped the floors of Marcus Hale's building 3 nights a week. He wore the same grey coveralls every shift, the fabric soft and thin from 100 washes, and he kept his eyes down, not out of weakness, but out of a habit built over 6 long years of trying not to be noticed. There had been a time when David commanded a room simply by entering it. He had been a Marine Corps combatives instructor, decorated twice, respected by men twice his rank, and later a rising star in a private security firm specializing in executive protection. He had traveled the world guarding people whose names appeared in headlines. He had trained under masters most people only read about in specialty magazines, men who taught the movement as if it were a form of prayer. But none of it mattered the day his wife, Elena, was diagnosed with an aggressive cancer that the doctors described in careful, clinical language as advanced. David spent every dollar he had saved and every dollar he could responsibly borrow, chasing treatments and second opinions and third opinions, refusing to accept any answer that ended with losing her. He sat beside her hospital bed for 14 months, holding her hand through chemotherapy, through the good days when she laughed at old sitcom reruns, and through the terrible ones when she could barely lift her head from the pillow, until the day the machines finally went quiet and the room grew unbearably, permanently still. After the funeral, David made a choice that surprised everyone who had once known him. He walked away from the six-figure security contracts, away from the prestige, away from a world that demanded he travel constantly and leave his daughter behind with sitters, relatives, and the occasional kind neighbor. He took a night job cleaning office buildings because it let him pick his daughter, Sophie, up from school every single afternoon, without exception. It let him make her breakfast before sunrise, braid her hair before the bus arrived, help with homework at the kitchen table, and tuck her into bed every single night, reading the same worn picture book until the pages nearly fell apart. Sophie was 7 years old, and she had already lost a mother. David was not going to let her lose a father to ambition too, no matter what it cost his pride. He never spoke about his old life, not to his co-workers, not to his supervisors, and not even to Sophie, who only knew her father as the quiet man who always smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish, who fixed a bicycle chain without being asked, and who never once raised his voice, even on the hardest nights when the grief still crept back in uninvited. The night of the Invitational, Marcus Hale's private dojo was packed with junior partners, minor athletes, a visiting state senator, and one nervous city councilman who had made the mistake of accepting an invitation he did not fully understand. One by one, Marcus threw them, each defeat cleaner and more theatrical than the last. He was genuinely skilled. That much was undeniable. But the way he fought had changed over the years. He no longer simply defeated his opponents. He lingered on the mat afterward, standing over them just a moment too long, letting the room absorb exactly who was superior and who was not, letting the cameras catch his practiced, magnanimous smile as he offered a hand to help them up. His personal assistant, eager to please and terrified of disappointing him, had been searching all week for a fresh face for the finale. Someone unexpected, someone Marcus could make an example of for the social media clips his team quietly produced after every event. She found David mopping the lobby after hours, exhausted from a double shift, and without asking a single question about his background, simply asked if he wanted to try Aikido for a night, promising a bonus added to his paycheck. David hesitated. He needed the money badly. Sophie needed new shoes for the fall, and the transmission on his old truck had been making a sound he did not like. He said yes on one condition, that his daughter could come watch, since he had no one else to leave her with that particular evening. When David walked onto the mat in his work coveralls, sleeves still faintly damp from mopping, the room erupted in quiet, cruel laughter. Marcus barely looked at him, already composing his next line for the cameras. "This should be over quickly," he said, loud enough for everyone in the room, including Sophie, to hear clearly. A few executives chuckled. Someone near the back raised their phone higher to get a better angle. Sophie's small hands tightened around her backpack straps until her knuckles turned white. She did not understand Aikido, and she did not understand the strange, cold rules of this room full of expensive suits. But she understood mockery instantly, the way children always do. And she understood that people were laughing at her father.
David felt something shift quietly inside his chest. Not anger, never anger, but a settled, familiar resolve he had not allowed himself to feel since the day he handed in his last military identification card and walked out of that life for good. He glanced once at Sophie, gave her the smallest, steadiest nod, and turned back toward the man in the white GI. Marcus lunged first, expecting an easy, clumsy opponent he could toss aside for the crowd's entertainment, and another 30 seconds of flattering footage. Instead, David moved. It was not flashy. It was economical, precise, and devastatingly calm, the kind of movement built from thousands of hours that most men in that room would never survive, let alone master. He redirected Marcus's momentum with a single, unhurried turn of his hip, and the billionaire, for the first time in 9 years, hit the mat. The laughter died instantly. The room fell into absolute, stunned silence, broken only by the soft creak of the mat settling and someone's phone nearly slipping from their hand. Marcus scrambled up, red-faced humiliation already curdling into something sharper, and attacked again, harder this time, driven by a panic he had not felt since his earliest years of training. David countered again, just as effortlessly, guiding the larger man's own force against him without a hint of malice, without a single wasted motion, without ever raising his voice or his eyes. A senior instructor sitting near the edge of the mat rose slowly to his feet, staring intently at David's stance, his footwork, the specific disciplined form that only a handful of elite military combatives instructors in the entire country had ever been certified to teach. That form, the instructor whispered to the man beside him, his voice trembling slightly. "I've only ever seen that from one man, Sergeant Coin." Whispers rippled through the crowd like wind through dry grass. Someone pulled up an old grainy news article on their phone, a decorated Marine combatives instructor, honored twice for valor, who had trained protection details for foreign dignitaries and high-ranking officials, who had simply vanished from public record years earlier after a personal tragedy no one in the article could quite name. Marcus stood frozen at the center of the mat, chest heaving, staring at the man he had hired for a joke, the man he had mocked in front of a room full of cameras and colleagues. "Who are you?" he finally asked, his voice stripped bare of all its earlier arrogance, almost childlike in its confusion. David simply straightened the collar of his coveralls and answered quietly, without a trace of triumph in his tone. "I'm the man who mops your floors, Mr. Hale, and I used to teach people how not to get hurt." He paused, glancing briefly toward his daughter. "I still do, apparently." At that moment, Sophie could not hold back any longer. She ran onto the edge of the mat, tears streaming freely down her face, not from sadness, but from a swelling, overwhelming pride she had never fully felt before. Watching the quiet man who braided her hair every morning stand taller than she had ever imagined he could, the room, still frozen in shock, began to applaud. First a few hesitant, uncertain claps, then a full standing ovation, executives and minor celebrities, and a visibly shaken senator, all rising to their feet for a janitor in gray coveralls and his daughter, both of them crying openly in front of everyone who had laughed just minutes before. Marcus Hale walked across that mat and did something he had not genuinely done in years. He apologized, sincerely, without a camera or an audience in mind, extending his hand not as a billionaire, but as a man who suddenly understood exactly how small his judgment had made him feel standing there. In the weeks that followed, Marcus quietly changed in ways his own staff noticed before he ever said a word about it. He stopped hosting the Invitational entirely, embarrassed by what it had always really been. He offered David a position training his executive security teams, at a salary that finally let Sophie stop wearing hand-me-down shoes and let David trade in the truck with the failing transmission. But David made one request before accepting the offer: that every member of the building's overnight cleaning staff receive a meaningful raise and full healthcare coverage, the same protection he wished desperately someone had offered his late wife years before her diagnosis turned everything upside down. Marcus agreed without a moment's hesitation, and for the first time in a long while, felt something closer to peace than pride when he signed the paperwork. Sophie grew up watching her father stand tall, not because of a title stitched onto a business card, but because of who he had always quietly been underneath the coveralls, underneath the exhaustion, underneath the years of grief he carried without ever once asking for sympathy. And somewhere in that story lies a truth worth remembering, one the narrator leaves with you now, gently. The way David once left his daughter with a bedtime story each night, true greatness isn't measured by titles, it's measured by character. Every person carries invisible battles, and the ones who carry them with quiet dignity are, more often than not, the strongest people in any room.